What is up, everyone? If this is your first time in with Real Talking J&J, we want to welcome you, but we also want to let you know this is season 2, episode 1. And if you guys have been listening of our season 1, we want to say welcome back, and we are so excited to be back.
Yeah, again, we're so excited to be here sharing this podcast with you, just giving you real talk, things that Jasmine and I have been through, things that we think are valuable for you to know, and that we'd want to share with you. So again, thank you so much. If you're new to the podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, share all the social media things. And if you're returning, same thing, like, subscribe, share. And we want your feedback. We want to hear from you guys. We're really doing this because we want to make an impact on you. So we love to hear from you guys. It means a lot. Also,
if you are returning viewers, you might notice there's like a little bit of a scenery change.
I don't know what you're talking about.
It looks a little bit different, but life happened. We are now here in Dallas.
Dallas, Texas.
We remember we were talking about it last season that we sold our house. So that's been
finalized. Yeah. Ready to go. Now we're here in Dallas. And we love it. So far it's been awesome. We love what God's been teaching us. We love the people that we've been able to hang out with. It's been super cool. I mean, I really like it so far. So we're excited to give you guys this podcast from a new view. For sure. So let's go ahead and get started.
Let's dive right in. Season 2, episode 1. We're going to dive right in with something not deep, but
a little bit deeper.
Kind of important. It's really important.
Very, very important, I think. I think what we want to talk about is, and I kind of want to get your perspective, is tough conversations. And in the sense of sometimes you need to go deeper. You need to be vulnerable. And you need to kind of, go to those places you don't really want to go with those you care about. And sometimes it's hard to do that. And so I guess, like, from your perspective, what was your view on tough conversations growing up, and how did you how has that developed over this 3 years of being married and stuff like that? For sure.
Prior to being married to you, I would say where I was at with tough conversations is I avoided it at all costs.
I think it's a lot of people.
It was something that just made me cringe. Just because, like, I'm not a confrontational person, so I would rather put down my feelings and how I felt about things, and would just rather go with the flow and make sure everyone else is happy. It's like, forget about my feelings, forget about this. Like, I'd rather not be uncomfortable and tell people what I really felt or how I really thought about these things, and just put it under cover. And I guess that's kind of something how I grew up. I was like, we didn't talk about like hard things. Like, kind of, we just put it under the rug, and like, we're still going to love each other. We're still going to do these things. It's just like, we forget about it kind of thing. So I think it was until like college where I had to start talking and getting deep and having tough conversations with people, because I guess as I got older, I'm like, you know what? My feelings do matter. And, I
need to communicate them.
Yeah. And I don't like the feeling of like always putting my feelings to the side to making sure someone else like is okay.
Yeah.
And that is important, to make sure other people are okay, but it's also important for you to be okay as well. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I got married with you where I felt like in the beginning of like our relationship, not in our relationship was like perfect and everything, but like in the beginning of our marriage where we had to confront a lot of things, I was so cringy. About it, because it's just like, I'm not mad. And I'm the kind of person, like, I show she's
mad.
I show my feelings, like, it's all on my face. Like, I cannot hide anything. And so once you upset me with something or you did something annoying, like,
always my fault, by the way. Yeah, for sure.
No, not true. But anyways, like, I would always just wear it on my face, and I would try to pretend like nothing happened, because I didn't want to talk about it. And it wasn't, because you are so persistent and so like, no, we need to talk about this now. That kind of got me out of my comfort zone and was able to have that. But that's because you were raised a different way from me. Like, you were raised totally opposite So kind of tell them about like how you were raised and how tough conversations were just kind of normal in your family.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but I think like growing up, the kind of everything was deeper and sometimes unnecessarily, I guess, but sometimes it was like, oh, there's a deeper root issue to why you're feeling a certain way or why you're reacting a certain way. And as a kid, I think we had a lot of, and I'm sure my brothers can attest to this, is family discussions, which I hated as a kid because, I mean, when you're younger, I don't think you appreciate the importance of a family discussion because you really don't understand sometimes yourself and what you're feeling. So when someone asks you to communicate it, you're just like, I'm mad, or this is frustrating, or I don't really know why that hurt me, or I don't know why I'm experiencing trauma. I don't understand the, gravity of the situation, I think. And so I used to get pretty frustrated. But as I got older and we would have these discussions, sometimes I also felt that they were unproductive because I'm like, you have a lot of strong personalities. And this is something we're going to kind of talk about today, is how you approach these conversations is so important, because a lot of times you come in there just heated. Like, I am so upset and I'm going to give them a piece of my mind, and the way that we approach
I'm gonna let them know what's up.
Yeah, we don't use like gentleness or kindness in our approach. We come in there frustrated, and so even when you do communicate a lot, sometimes when you communicate, it's hurtful to the extent that you're really just kind of make them feel your pain. Versus actually understand how we're going to get to a resolution, because I think it's so frustrating when you have a tough conversation and it seems like nothing happens.
Yeah.
You just lay your feelings out there and everyone's kind of just like, okay, well, guess we're going to keep doing the same thing. And I think a reason that happens though is because, sometimes you come in there pretty hot-headed. You're very opinionated. Sometimes you're not even self-reflective. You're just all about everything is wrong with everybody else. And so tough conversations. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but humility is a huge part of having tough conversations on both ends. Yeah. Honesty is important. Yes, you want to be honest about your feelings, but you also want to be humble enough to realize that maybe you're wrong in some areas, but also honest enough to know that, like, no, I'm not wrong about this area. I've thought this through and we've communicated this to a certain level so that you're not like easily manipulated or anything like that. So,
yeah. And a lot of things that we are going to talk about in this conversation about tough conversations is we're going to be going back to a lot of our things that we talked about in communication, the way we communicate, because everything really ties into that. So if you haven't seen that, you can go back to season 1 and look at communications. But just like Joshua said, we kind of give both of our point of views of like how we grew up with this topic. And now we want to dive in and like talk about what we learned. Yeah, what we learned and why is this important? Why are tough conversations important?
I mean, I think it's needed. Is the first thing. We need these conversations because you can't really have depth in a relationship unless you're willing to go a little bit deeper. And for an example of this, there's a lot of people I know on a surface level, and we have, acquaintances that we'll talk and we'll say hi, and we'll talk about, sports, or we'll talk about
butterflies and flowers. There's nothing wrong.
We'll talk about Taylor Swift. Great. We'll talk about anything, but then there's people that are closer to you, family, close friends, where, sometimes they say something that is hurtful, or sometimes they have a behavior trait that isn't necessarily healthy, or sometimes they don't communicate how they're feeling. And so when these conversations come up, a lot of times we have, the response of in Jasmine's case, where you're like, I'm just going to avoid it. I'm just going to pretend everything's fine. Or in my case, where sometimes you come into them pretty hot and you're like, wait a second, like maybe I need to understand what's really going on here. I think like
there's not a perfect, because no one's perfect, but there's a balance between of like, no, you should not hide everything that you feel or whatever like that, or the other spectrum of like, going in on everything. Like there's just a balance that is sweet and able to obtain. And that's something that we've learned and what we've walked through. And kind of, I'm not saying that we're perfect and we know exactly how to do everything, but like I've learned how to have tough conversations, and they're still, I would say till this day, they're still not my favorite, but I'm able to have them.
and they're needed, because if in order to really live your be your true self with somebody, you need to be able to communicate how you're feeling.
Yes.
You need to be able to understand how they are feeling, and you need to be able to like work together, like through grace. Like sometimes there's grace that you need to have towards somebody, but it is a lot easier to just feel love and to walk with somebody through life when you are on the same page. When you're honest and humble about it, you're able to grow in your relationships. You're able to go deeper. You're able to experience healing. I think this is something we kind of gloss over a lot of times, but the reason we have tough conversations is typically because there is something in us, whether it's a trauma, whether it's some type of past experience that we need healing from. And if we don't talk about that thing in a, humble, honest way, we're not actually going to get healing, because it's just going to keep getting pushed down, and we're not really addressing the root of the problem.
Yeah. And I think one thing that made me not like tough conversations, or just kind of made me avoid it, was being vulnerable. It was hard for me to be vulnerable to not some people, just to people in general, because I always wanted the outer appearance of everything's fine, I'm good, nothing's wrong with me, I'm always going to be good. And that's not, in reality, that's not always true. So it was so hard for me to be vulnerable and say, you know what, sometimes, no, I'm not feeling okay. No, like I am hurting, or like that actually hurt my feelings, or I have feelings. Like I felt like I try to be this robot of, I had no feelings, like no one could ever hurt me, or just, I don't know. It's just the weirdest thing. And to be able to have these conversations, like you have to be vulnerable. And that was so hard for me. Like even in our marriage, like we're married, we're one, and it was hard for me to be vulnerable sometimes. And it wasn't until those special moments where we like, no, we need to know everything about each other. And I like broke down and was able to tell like you anything and everything. And I was just so vulnerable in that moment. But what's important, if you're on the other side of the person being vulnerable, that you are actively listening. Like you are there, like you're showing them that you respect them.
Don't minimize what they're saying.
Yeah. You respect their vulnerability. And I think that's what was important for me to be able to do that. Like, I guess kind of for the first time was for you, how you reacted to it and how you received it. And it was like, oh, people do care, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and again, we'll talk more about this in the like when we talk about humility, because I think that's really one of the most important parts. But when someone you love or someone you care about is communicating to you something that they feel that you've done, it's easy to be defensive. It's easy to be like, wait, no, you understand. And that is the moment where we need grace. Sometimes you're in the wrong, and you need to have the humility to know that. Sometimes they're in the wrong, and you need to have the grace not to overreact. Like, we're all human beings here. This whole idea that we're always going to communicate perfectly it's not real. We can try our best, and we can create environments, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. How we approach these conversations is very important. Again, you can come in and you can bottle it up, and then you can explode. And if that's the way that you approach it, that's not necessarily, actually, that's not a great way to yield a good, fruitful result to that conversation. Typically, it's going to...
Just because, like, if you throw on something to that other person, they're going to get really defensive, and they're going to be on the attack mode too, and say, well, you think this about me, but this is what I think about you.
Yeah.
And then you're just going to go into an argument that is very unnecessary.
Yeah, it's very unproductive. And that's our natural state as human beings. We want to get defensive. We want to defend ourselves and say no. And that's where, again, you got to be humble. Like, we're not perfect. So you're going to have moments where you're in the wrong. And I think that's timing of these conversations. And I think we talked about this in one of our old podcasts, but like, when you talk about these things is also important. Like, if you're at dinner with friends, you don't need to like have a tough conversation right there. If you're at the grocery store and the person is focused on something else and they're on a business call, and you want to be annoyed that they got the 2% milk instead of the whole milk because you're on this special diet, and like that's what you want to bring up, like,
that's a real tough conversation.
Not that that's ever happened. But like, I think like when you have these conversations, is it one, does that person have the time to talk about that? And if you have real relationships, people, you need to make time. Like, this isn't just like, oh, I'm so busy, I can never talk about anything.
And it's not always just about you and your timing. You have to think about the other person as well.
And set a time, because this is someone you care about, to be like, we're going to have a conversation. And this could be as easy as, hey babe, are you free? Like, how are you? What are you up to? Like, if me and Jasmine are, home and it's at night and I know that we don't have anything to go, I might think, oh, that's a decent time to bring this up. If it's 6 a.m. in the morning and we're about to head out to work, maybe that's not the time, because it also, there's a time constraint on it. People are maybe focused on getting ready and focused on getting ready to leave, so they're not really focused on what you're saying. So I think just be mindful of timing when you do this. And if you don't feel like make time. Be like, hey, can we go to coffee? Can we go to lunch? Can we have some time? And I mean, it's easier when we're married because we know what each other's schedule is. But if we're talking about parents or friends or other people, sometimes it's like, hey, let's set a dedicated time where we can, talk about this.
Yes. And then I'm also the kind of person too of like, I'm going to find the perfect moment. I'm not going to pre-orchestrate this. Like, it's just going to flow, and I'm going to wait till the perfect moment. And a lot of times, like, the perfect moment happens and like my heart is beating and I'm like sweating, not like really, but in my head I am. And it's like, oh my gosh, I know this is the time that I need to talk about it. And I get chicken and I get scared. But if you want to, like Josh said, go ahead, set up the time and everything. But I'm the kind of person of like, oh, it's going to happen naturally. And a lot of the times I've grown, and yes, I've had those tough conversations in the right timing and it just happened naturally. But some people are just so busy that you actually have, like, where's my colored coordinated calendar people?
Yeah.
For you, you're going to have to put a little calendar reminder to have a conversation. For me, I'm more a little bit laid back. But
I mean,
yes.
And sometimes there's never the perfect opportunity. Sometimes there is. Sometimes it's naturally just because you're having a conversation and you start to go down that route and you're like, hey, here's something I want to talk about. Here's something that I've thought about. Here's something that I feel I want your perspective. Sometimes that moment doesn't necessarily always come though, right? And so it's very important that we are intentional about taking time to make those conversations happen when they are needed.
For sure.
Because you don't just want to live in this perpetual state of, oh, I know there's like an elephant in the room, but we're just going to pretend there's not an elephant in the room, or I'm going to treat you differently and start being passive aggressive, or I'm not going to have the same level of respect for you because I have a misunderstanding about something. Like, and this happens so many times. I mean, how many of you guys have watched a Hallmark movie, or honestly any movie where two people just don't communicate and they begin to do hurtful things to one another just because they're not on the same page, and they could have had a tough conversation about what one person said or did, and that entire movie could have changed and we could have, been out of there in 15 minutes. But
in reality, it was all just a miscommunication.
Yeah.
It was like they were basically on the same page, but it wasn't delivered correctly. So yeah, now that we see that, we're like, oh my goodness, if they just communicated this early on. And then I'm like, oh my goodness, what have we come to?
Yeah. And so timing's a big thing. I think tone, or how you talk about something, is important too. Try to avoid phrases like, hey, you did this and you meant this, and accusing people and then assuming what they meant.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, none of us can fully know what someone else is thinking or what their intentions are. And so when we go into a conversation, it's so important that we frame it like, hey, this is what I saw that happened. This is how it made me feel. I want your perspective on this. And they might be like, oh my goodness, I didn't even think about that. I was totally in this mode and I'm so sorry. And it could be as quick as that. Sometimes it's, hey, someone I've known for a long time, there's been a pattern, and this is something that's deep, and what you've done, this instant hurt me, and this particular thing hurt me. And like, I don't know what your intention was, but like, I remember this specific example, and this has kind of caused resentment in my heart. And so I want to open the floor because there's some things, there's some trauma, there's some stuff that I've been through that, I'm not saying that it's, and again, this is not saying it's all their fault, but it's saying these are things that happened that caused me to react a certain way that I haven't talked about before. Because typically tough conversations come out of things that we haven't talked about for months, years, even that have maybe hurt us that we kind of like, put down.
Yeah. And most of our viewers know, like, we're firm believers of God and like the Bible and everything. And that what sums this up of how we approach this conversation important. Like, I really like in Ecclesiastes 3:7 where it says there's a time to speak and there's a time to keep silent.
Yeah.
And we've discussed this. Like, it's really important to know the time and the place and the context. And it makes the conversation just so much better when you have all those three correct.
Yeah. I mean, it makes conversations more likely to be successful when you think about those aspects before just going in there, heated. Yeah.
And then also like we said, there's a time to have the conversation. So let's say someone did offend you and you're in a setting of a group setting, something like that. You don't automatically have to go back and be like, hey, you just hurt my feelings in front of everyone. You can step back, keep silent a little bit of
have
like
some tact.
Yeah. Like, just say, okay, like what you just said was kind of offensive, but I'm going to be cool. I'm going to keep my cool right now. I'm going to keep calm and collective. Right. And it doesn't mean like you have to be fake and be like, oh my goodness. Like, just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, you could still be real, but you don't have to confront them right away.
Yeah. I mean, I think even the Bible talks about this. I can't remember where it talks about this, but it's like, if you have an offense with somebody, like, go to them first. Typically what we do is someone offends us and then we go to our friend like, I can't believe they did this, blah, 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 blah. And we immediately start festering on that and start fueling that feeling instead of being like, hey, so like back there, I just want to pull you aside. This is something I didn't appreciate, or, hey, like you said this, I don't know what you meant, but like, here's how I'm feeling about it. And being real. And again, sometimes, there's a time to say that and there's a time to keep silent, but then like once you've talked to that person first, like, and if maybe there is a deeper issue and there hasn't been resolution, then you can bring someone else into it. And then you can submit it to, leaders and mentors and stuff like that. Like, but it's not fair to talk behind someone's back and to tell everybody else how you feel without telling them how you feel. I think it's super important that we also keep that in mind.
Yeah. And I think something that we're going to start talking about it now is that humility and honesty are how these conversations are effective.
Yeah.
And this is how things and problems are going to be solved is, one, if we're humble.
Yeah.
Two, if we're honest about our feelings. I think that's what was really hard for me, because I told you, like, I didn't like telling everybody about my feelings. I felt like if I was vulnerable about my feelings, like, it kind of put me in a weaker position. And that was so wrong. And if you are in that mindset of like, you don't want to have feelings or all these things because it's going to put you, if you're going to be weak, that's totally a really bad mindset to have. It's good to be vulnerable. You're human. You're going to have feelings. And if someone hurts your feelings, like, that's okay. Like, it's okay to have your feelings hurt. It doesn't make you weak.
I feel like we can't have authentic relationships if we aren't vulnerable at some level, because otherwise you're always portraying I'm perfectly fine, nothing hurts me, and then I might be portraying the same thing of like, well, she's fine, nothing bothers me. Like, we can't really get deep and really know each other and really have an understanding of who that person is until you're able to be vulnerable.
That's basically a surface level relationship.
Yeah. And it takes humility to get there though, because it's hard to give up our pride. It's hard to say, oh, this shouldn't bother me, but it is, like, oh, maybe this, and maybe sometimes that's the wrong thinking of, oh, it shouldn't bother me. Like, maybe it should bother you. And that's why it's bothering you. And you need to understand, obviously we need to like adjudicate our feelings to know, what is actually us being petty versus what is actually something that we need to talk about. But at the same time, our feelings can kind of help us be like, wait a second, like, that wasn't okay the way that they talked to me. That was disrespectful. Or that wasn't okay the way they made that joke. That is something I told them in confidence. Like, there are so many things that we need to, like, when we feel those feelings, we can't just be like, oh, it doesn't bother me. Because that's how we slowly build up walls. And that's how we slowly, that's where the honesty part comes in. It's like, vulnerable, it requires both humility and honesty at the same time, because it's like, hey, I'm being vulnerable to give you the honest truth about what I'm thinking. But also having the humility to be like, I could be wrong. Like I could have perceived something wrong. I could have said, oh, you meant this. And I assumed that when you actually meant something else. And I think that's a huge part of it as well, that we have to think about.
I think one of my favorite things that you do when we have conversations, or like something like a tough conversation or everything, you always bring back the scenario. So it's never just like, you always do this or you always do that. It's like, hey, at this particular moment, this happened. This is how I received this. Is this what you meant? And I never was really brought up like that or whatever. And that really opened my heart and my eyes of saying like, oh, wow. So I do remember this conversation. I remember how I projected it. Oh, I'm sorry that my tone was off, and I can see how you received it that way. So I'm sorry for my tone. That was totally on me. Yes, that was me. But I didn't mean it this way. This is what I meant. And
sometimes you did mean it that way.
Yeah,
and that's where it's also being like humility. Like sometimes I do things or I say things and I know what I'm doing and I like decide to make the wrong decision. And that's again where grace comes in, because we are human beings, and sometimes you are going to be petty and you are going to decide to do something that you said, hey, we communicated, we're not going to do this, or this is the standard that we have in a relationship, and you just go behind the back, or you do something that you know is wrong. And that's where you have to have the humility to be like, I'm sorry. Like,
it's just funny because like I kind of see it now as like, you know how there's a math formula and like you just put X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. But like there's conversation formulas of like how you can be better. Like I really do like how you say you just bring up what the problem was.
Yeah,
like what was the focus, and bring your feelings in it. And then I also love how you never assume what my intentions were. And that's something that I always did, of like, this is what you meant when you said this, and da 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 da. And that's confrontation. That's like, I'm already assuming something else.
We have the argument in our head before we get there. So then when you get there, you're like, I've already done this entire argument. I already know how this is going to end. And so we don't actually give the other person
a chance.
I think there's a verse in Proverbs that I think it's 12:18 where it says like, thoughtless words, like those will like deeply wound somebody. Like when you don't think, and you just speak out of hate, when you speak out of frustration. But it also says like, if you speak words with wisdom, or when you speak words wisely, that can bring healing. When we have a conversation and we're just saying thoughtless accusations of, you always do this, I can't believe it, you make me mad when you do this, I hate this, this, and this, and this, that is going to create deep wounds. But what can heal those wounds is us being wise to say, you know what, here's exactly what happened in this situation. I'm assuming the best. This is kind of frustrating. I want your perspective. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to understand what you're doing. I'm going to be honest when I'm wrong. I'm going to expect the same from you. And when we have those components, when we have humility, when we have vulnerability, when we have, just being super authentic, that is what is going to bring healing, because we're able to speak wise words, not just words that are coming out of a place of frustration and hate.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And I think just to kind of like summarize what we talked about, and what's really important is like, one, tough conversations are needed. You can't just beat around the bush and everything be Taylor Swift concerts. Shout out. No, I'm just kidding. No, but seriously, like these are very important. And also not only are they important, like how you approach it is important. Like
important.
Don't just go off and do everything. We're not telling you to start conflict with everyone. No, we're telling you to be bold, have tough conversations, but also be smart.
Be thoughtful.
Also be humble. Be honest. Have some humility. You're not always right. That's something that I've had to learn. When you get married, you're going to know, like, you are not always right. Even though you were brought up a certain way, your ways are not the only ways.
Not the only ways.
And I've learned that the hard way, because we both kind of like to be right.
Yeah, for sure.
We've grown that to be both humble.
I think like at the end of the day, if you want to have productive conversations, when you approach things the correct way, when you understand the time and place to have a tough conversation, when you are humble and honest, if someone else is wrong, it's a lot easier to see that from your perspective because you've approached it from a place of kindness, a place of gentleness, a place of I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt. I'm being humble and honest about, hey, I also did this. I understand that. I'm sorry for this. And this wasn't right. Like when you're able to do that, it also kind of prompts the other person to, they have either two responses. They can either, double down on their position, or they can be like, you know what, I was also wrong. I also see what you're saying now. I also want to go there. And that helps you kind of see like, you know what, there is ground to be made up here. And those tough conversations are slowly,
It honestly gives them the opportunity to be humble and to be honest. You opened a safe space for them. So we want to encourage you.
Yeah.
To be bold, to go off. If you're thinking right now, like, oh, I do need to talk to someone about this, like, go make plans.
Yeah.
Think about that conversation you want to have.
Be thoughtful in what you're going to say. Like, think through it. Make sure that you've evaluated your feelings, and then be ready to have your feelings reevaluated, because your perspective is only your perspective, and the whole perspective is where we really see healing, because we're able to, really talk through these things. So definitely like take these things to heart. Like everybody out there has a tough conversation that needs to be had. There is a timing and place, and sometimes we need to create that. Sometimes it'll come naturally, but when the time comes, remember, be humble, be honest, but be humble. And have grace on people, because that is so important if we want to see these tough conversations yield, and bring forth more, authentic friendships, relationships, family relationships, all those things.
So we want to thank you so much for listening in. We can't wait for this season 2. Season 2 is going to be amazing.
Yeah, so excited, guys.
We want to know your thoughts, what you think. And if you did have a tough conversation, we want to know how it went.
Yeah.
So please comment, like, subscribe.
Feel free to,
share.
shoot a DM. Like, we want to hear from you guys. We want to know what you guys are thinking. How are you guys consuming the content? We're so excited to be with you guys again for season 2. Love you guys, and God bless.
Bye.